And if this is your first time with us, my name is Ben, and I am one of the co-pastors here, and we couldn't be more delighted that you have chosen to worship with us this morning. We are picking up today in part 4 of a 7-week series that we are calling Riverfront 3.0, where we are exploring and looking at kind of our strategic plan, our strategic focus points that we believe that God is calling us to over the coming years, really the coming decade. And this morning, I want to talk to you about the focus of spiritual formation. Specifically, how are we going to develop the value of spiritual formation in our congregation, in our community, for each and every one of us? And let me just address this tension up front. As soon as I said spiritual formation, like 70% of you started to tune me out. 20% maybe started would listen, but only because you feel a little guilty if you don't listen to the pastor. 10% of you got really excited and were kind of thinking to yourself, finally, we're talking about something that the church should be doing. You know, even the term spiritual formation sounds a bit churchy, a little cliche, and the kind of thing that only super spiritual people and pastors get excited about. So I hope that whoever you are in kind of that 70%, 20%, 10%, that you will stick with me this morning as we explore what spiritual formation is really all about. Because I think that what we're talking about this morning is so foundational, so core to who we are as disciples, as followers of Jesus, as spiritual seekers, frankly, as human beings. And let me submit to you that what we're talking about this morning is critically important, foundationally, intrinsically important. Healthy spiritual formation is the process by which you and I, through training, through practice, become more like Jesus. Or another way to think about it, and I like this phrase, is that it's how we become most fully human. See, I believe that every human being on planet Earth is a deeply spiritual being. Whether you're religious or not, whether you adhere to a particular religious system or not, whether you would consider yourself a Christian or a Christ follower or not, that we are deeply spiritual people and deeply spiritual beings. And how we form that spirituality in us, how we literally form our souls, is as important as how we form our bodies or our minds or anything else about us. And healthy spiritual formation is that very process, that we become who God most intended us to be, fully human and alive. And coming from a 2,000-year history of the church, of the Christian church, of Christ followers, we believe here that being like Jesus, being able to answer the question and then follow through on what would Jesus do, how would Jesus engage the world, literally to become more like him, is at its core the picture, right, of what our end goal in life is all about. What is it that I want to accomplish before I die? Well, I want my heart and my mind and my eyes and my hands and my feet and my soul, my core being, to increasingly become more like Jesus's. Or in other words, more completely and fully human. The Apostle Paul in Colossians says that in Jesus, the fullness of God and the fullness of humanity are both revealed. Right, that's the mystery of our faith. That Jesus is 100% God and 100% human, and that in him both the divine and yet the fully human are revealed. And so when we say that we want to become more like Jesus and look more like Jesus and act more like Jesus. What we're talking about is how do we become more fully human, the way that God intended and created us to be. So I believe that compassion is fundamentally human. I believe that weeping at injustice is fundamentally human. I believe that the pull and the desire to go march in the streets for the sake of justice is human. I believe that to create beauty with paint and chalk and pencil and music and instruments is fundamentally human. I believe to laugh deeply is to be fully human. I believe to dream broadly and bigly is fundamentally human. And I actually think that we use this phrase sometimes, like when we fail, when we fall, and say, oh, I'm just human. And I wish we would reverse that and say that when we achieve big things, when we dream bigger things, that's when we're fully human. But when we fail, when we fall, when we don't dare to dream, we actually fall short of the full humanity that God intends for each of us. Spiritual formation is about you and I becoming more like Jesus, but just as importantly, you and I becoming who God has uniquely created each one of us to be, fully human, fully alive. Dallas Willard puts it this way. He's a great theologian and writer on spiritual formation, been incredibly influential in our day. He writes this: in spiritual formation, we are aiming at a character and life that is so shaped that the deeds of Christ routinely and easily come from what is inside. In other words, that to act like Christ becomes habitual, a habit, a muscle memory, right? That our core response to the world is to act like Jesus. So how do we get there? What does good spiritual formation look like in the church? But first, let me address why are we even talking about this? How did this become one of our top 6? Well, frankly, it's because you all have been asking for it. As we've listened to people on our surveys, every survey we've put out there says this. Everyone keeps saying, we want to go deeper. We want to be challenged. We want to grow deeper spiritually. We've had conversations, ongoing conversations about so much that's unique and safe and good and beautiful about our unique environment here at Riverfront. Is that we're a place where people can deconstruct their faith and also have a place to reconstruct it. In other words, to think deeply about these issues of spiritual formation. How are we being formed by that which we think about and dwell upon and act upon spiritually? I think the success of our book club, right? I mean, really, let's be honest, one of the most successful ministries that we have had all year has been the Sunday morning book club, right? Dozens of you go there and commit to it early on Sunday mornings and are doing some really in-depth, deep reading. You know, Richard Rohr is not easy to get our heads around, and yet you guys are engaging with him and talking and moving on to other ideas. But it's a longing, I think it comes from a longing for depth, for groundedness, to think deeply about spiritual issues and about formation. The number of people in huddles who are committing to being in huddles, which are really about spiritual formation. Let's be honest, the longing, I think why we come to church, why we connect together, why we're here on Sundays, why we persevere through Zoom services, is because we have a longing to encounter the divine, the spiritual, the transcendent, and to be transformed by that encounter. So as we think about, we dream about, what healthy spiritual formation looks like for us, I believe that it's going to take a paradigm shift away from how we have been thinking about it, and frankly, most churches think about it, to a new way. In fact, I think it's going to take 5 paradigm shifts, 5 specific paradigm shifts, and that's just what I want to lay out for you this morning. And we'll explore these more in depth probably in a series this fall or coming up. But here, let me present to you kind of 5 paradigm shifts that each of us need to take individually and as a community as we kind of focus on authentic, deep, significant spiritual formation. All right, are you ready? If you take notes, these would be good to jot down because I think you can reflect upon these later, talk about them in your huddle, in your small groups, or as a family. So shift number one, our paradigm shift, we need to shift from extraordinary to ordinary in our mindset. We need to shift from thinking that spiritual formation is some extraordinary idea to recognizing it as an ordinary part of every disciple's life. Now, often I think that we think of spiritual formation as something that's only reserved for super Christians, right? That 10% who got really excited at the beginning of my sermon. That we think of spiritual formation as people for the super spiritual, the superheroes of our faith. Right? The ones who join 6 huddles and 4 reading groups and memorize 462 scriptures every year. But no, I fundamentally believe, and I think we need to shift our paradigm around this. The spiritual formation is for everyone. And not just in the church, and not just for Christ followers. But the truth is that you and I, that every human being that's alive, we are being spiritually formed by the world every day. Everything we do, all things are spiritual. Right? So spiritual formation doesn't just happen in the church. All things are spiritual. So what we do at work and how we entertain ourselves and what we feed our mind through media and screen time, how we interact with each other, what we read, the places that we go walk and hike and when we're in nature and the things we create, all of these spiritually form us. John Ortberg, one of my favorite authors, writes this: a spiritual formation is for everyone. Just as there's an outer you that is being formed and shaped all the time, like it or not, by accident or on purpose, so there's an inner you. You have a spirit, and it's constantly being shaped and tugged at by what you hear and watch and say and read and think and experience. Just as our outer bodies are being formed by what we do or do not do, our inner bodies, our inner selves, our spirits, our souls, are being formed by everything. Spiritual formation and the intentional, conscientious awareness of how our soul is being shaped. That's the ordinary life. That's the ordinary life. That's not extraordinary. That's not for spiritual saints. That's not for the super spiritual. That's actually just for you and me. And every human being on planet Earth. And so we need to change our mindset, have a paradigm shift from thinking that it's just kind of extra credit. It's just PhD level Christianity. The idea that every human being is being formed daily, spiritually, at a soul level. And then asking, how do you want your spirit, how do you want your soul to be formed? All right. The second paradigm shift that needs to take place is what I call we need to shift from trying to training. From trying to training. The Apostle Paul, in his letter to the Corinthians, his first letter, chapter 9, says this, picking up in verse 25. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last. But we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Therefore, I do not run like someone running aimlessly. I do not fight like a boxer beating the air. No, I strike a blow to my body, and I make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself may not be disqualified for the prize. Paul writes with some intensity here, doesn't he? But the point is that he says that we spiritually we go into training. And it's important that he uses the term or the analogy of athletic training. I think it's a really good analogy. Again, John Ortberg asked us to consider what it would be like to be doing what we do every night. Right? Let's imagine that we're sitting on the couch eating Twinkies and potato chips. When suddenly the phone rings, you answer it, and to your surprise, it is the U.S. Olympic Committee. You have been chosen to compete in the marathon for the U.S. Olympic team. Yes, you. Twinkie eating, potato chip munching, TV watching you going to the Olympics. Oh, you're excited. You're going to the Olympics. Millions of people will be watching. You can't wait to tell your friends. But wait, you realize that you can't just show up to the Olympics and run a marathon. I mean, right, you've never run a marathon before. You don't know the first thing about it. How goofy, what were you thinking? So the first thing the next morning, you head off to the library and you check out a stack of books on marathon running. Marathon Running for Dummies, The Idiot's Guide to Marathon Running, right? 1, 2, 3 Marathon Run. All these books, all these on training you how to run a marathon. You read about famous runners, marathon or otherwise. You memorize the life story of Steve Prefontaine. You change your name to Steve Prefontaine or Stephanie Prefontaine. You buy every T-shirt you can find with one of his quotes on it. And then you have a bunch of more custom-made ones. And you change your email signature to an inspirational quote by a great runner. And of course, since you're a TV kind of person, you rent Chariots of Fire and you watch it 1,000 times. You subscribe to Runner's World. You start hanging out with Cindy Perkins, following her to the store and buying the same shoes she wears. Right? You start saying stuff like, be the change you want to see in the world. And man imposes his own limitations, so don't set any. You memorize Philippians 4:13 out of context, as we talked about in our Philippians series, but you memorize it anyway. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. You're pumping yourself up. You check in on Facebook every time you go out for a speed walk or jog. Never has there been a U.S. Olympic runner who's been more pumped up and enthusiastic than you. Never has anyone been so determined to win. You're working as hard as you possibly can to make this dream a reality. You left no stone unturned, no book unread, with one small exception. As you stand there on the day of the race with the other runners, and you notice that their bodies, they look different than yours. They look like cucumbers, firm, lean. And yours? One more Twinkie, kind of squishy and soft. And for a split second, you wonder. You wonder if maybe instead of doing all that reading, you should have gone out and tried to run a little bit. But quickly you put that out of your mind and you remember all those great quotes you memorized. I mean, you say to yourself, sure, I haven't actually done any running, but I want it more. I have the drive. I have the passion. I'm in it to win it. I'm ready to be the change and not to set any limitations. I can do all things through Christ. And the more you repeat this, the more excited you get. And suddenly the gun goes off. It's race time. You and all the other runners take off. And I'll let you take it from there because I think you know how this story ends. Not well. What's wrong with this story? Well, what's wrong is thinking that if you learn a lot about marathon running, you could just show up and run a marathon by trying really hard. When that gun goes off, all the education, all the information, all the inspiration on the planet is not going to amount to anything beyond about 50 yards. If you fail to include dedication to the kinds of activities and practices and drills that will enable you to run this race. See, you might have followed Cindy to the store but you failed to follow her to the gym. And it's not in the store, but rather in the gym that you become the kind of person who is capable of running marathons. Inspiration and education, in fact, are only valuable when they are used in conjunction with practices known to actually make it possible for you to run. Right? The error was in choosing trying over training. Trying won't get you very many things that matter much in life. Steady training, however, will surely get you where you need to go. Because everything we do forms us. It's true of physical formation as well as spiritual formation. It's true in all that we do. And so we want to create a focus on training, not trying. Every one of you, when asked, would probably say that you would like to try to have a better spiritual life, a better prayer life, a better connection to God. And often we try, we show up at things, we read the books. But spiritual formation is about practice. In fact, one of our core values, and it goes all the way back to Pastor Nancy, one of our core values here at Riverfront is that we embrace spiritual practices. And in those spiritual practices, prayer and reading the scriptures and training ourselves to hear the voice of God at our huddles. Learning to sit in silence. The contemplative life. And learning what it means to seek after justice in an activistic life. We go and we train and we get better at it. And better. Spiritual formation, healthy spiritual formation, is going to be about you and I. And we're going to stop trying and we're going to start training. We want to give you the tools to really develop the muscles that we know are there, but we haven't used much. Right? Have you ever worked with a trainer? For a while I was working with a physical trainer. And literally I feel like every time I was at the gym, we discovered a muscle or a muscle group that I'd never used before. And it was so painful to start to use it and to work it out. But then it got better because we practiced and because we trained. Our second paradigm shift is from just trying to be spiritual people to embracing the idea of training to become healthily spiritually formed in our souls. Yes? You with me? Amen? All right. Here's the third paradigm shift. The third paradigm shift is that we need to shift our mindset from programs to pathways. From programs to pathways. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, in other words, since we are part of this great community of faith, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. And let us run with perseverance, sounds like we're training, let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For who the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. There's a pathway. There's a route. There's a run. There's a race marked before us for you and I to run. And we want to run that race. We want to run that pathway, keeping our eyes on Jesus who's gone down it before. And too often, spiritual formation is reduced in the life of the church to certain programs. Take this class. Go to this event. Listen to this sermon. But what it lacks is kind of an authenticity, a genuineness, an idea that it's not about a program, but it's really about a lifelong journey, a pathway that as we run that path, as we walk that path, as we explore that path, right, we begin to discover who we are spiritually, who we are as full human beings. One of my favorite theologians and writers, Howard Thurman, puts it this way. There is something in every one of you that waits and listens for the sound of the genuine in yourself. It is the only true guide you will ever have. And if you cannot hear it, you will all of your life spend your days on the ends of strings that somebody else is pulling. I love that. Until you can hear that genuineness, until you can find that genuineness spirit in your life. We're like puppets with somebody else pulling all the strings. And that's what happens when we get focused too much on programs. Sometimes I've been in churches, not this one, but I've been a pastor in churches where people always say, Pastor, we need more classes to do this, and we need more groups to do that, and we need to start new ministries to do this, that, and the other thing. And we become so busy doing programs and showing up at scheduled events and meetings that we have no time, no energy, no space to actually discover the pathway that we're on. One of the things that we want to do as a church is to help you and me and all of us discover genuinely, authentically who we are. Discover our primary pathway to God. Author Richard Foster has done a lot of work on this, and he talks about different spiritual pathways, and historically he's identified 6 primary pathways, and he talks about them in several of his books. And the idea is that every one of us is kind of wired differently, right? Some of us, a walk outside in nature, among the beauty of nature, is the primary way that we connect with God. Others of us, we haven't learned how to do that yet. Right? But others, it's when we engage our mind that we most connect with God. And for other people, it's when they engage their creativity. These are all different pathways, right? And what we want you to do is not to run my pathway, not to do my pathway, my way, but to discover who God has wired you to be. How do you most intimately connect with your Heavenly Father, with your Heavenly Mother? How do you connect most with the Spirit and with Jesus? And we want to help you discover that pathway and pursue that pathway, and then learn about it and practice other pathways, right? So that we can kind of broaden our experience of the divine, of the transcendent. And so we're going to spend a lot of time exploring and exposing different ideas and pathways. We're going to do that in our huddles. That's one of the major changes I think that was going to take place in our huddles this coming year, and in the huddle group that I'm leading this summer with potential leaders, is we want to help you discover multiple different pathways to God and figure out what's your most authentic pathway, and as opposed to just following one idea. So our shift number 3 is really we're going to shift from programs to pathways. All right, number 4. The 4th paradigm shift that we really need to embrace is from assembly lines to greenhouses. From assembly lines to greenhouses. Too often in the modern church, I think we have seen, and that's when I say we, I think leaders and pastors have seen spiritual formation, spiritual growth as an assembly line, like we're creating widgets, right? If we can get you to go through the following 4 steps and programs and classes and do these things and show up in this place, that we can produce little Jesuses, little Christians, literally Christians, right? Christianettes. And then if you would just do those things, right, that somehow you'll be spiritually formed from your core and from your soul. It used to be that we would think things like this, that if someone came on Sunday and belonged to a small group and tithed regularly and volunteered regularly and used their gifts, that if they did those things that we've outlined, in other words, if they showed up and did those steps, they would experience healthy spiritual formation. And unfortunately, what we've discovered, and what many of you have discovered, is that's not actually true. That you can show up with the best intentions. You can be first in line and ready for small group early. You can take notes during every sermon. You can tithe religiously. And yet not have your soul being transformed more and more into the likeness of Jesus. Because too often we viewed it as widgets, as mechanics, as an assembly line. when we should really see it as a much more organic process of a greenhouse, of a garden, of how do we cultivate spiritual formation in our lives. Richard Rohr writes this. He says, spirituality is about being ready. All the spiritual disciplines of your life, prayer, study, meditation, ritual religious vows, are there so you can break through to the eternal. Spirituality is about awakening the eyes, the ears, the heart, so you can see what's happening right in front of you. So you can see what's already taking place, the growth that God is already doing. And I think the best metaphor for spiritual formation, or the best metaphor for how the church should engage the process and work of spiritually forming each of us together, is that of a greenhouse. That in a greenhouse, what we try to do is we create the space, the environment, the ecosystem necessary for healthy spiritual growth. We all need nutrients and sunlight and soil and water to grow. But we're all different plants, and we're going to grow in different ways. And we need different amounts of water and different amounts of sunlight. And we might thrive during different seasons. We're all different. But we all need a healthy environment to grow. And our task as a church, our focus as a church, our calling as a church, is to create a greenhouse where each and every person that God brings to us, sends to us, draws into our community, can thrive, can grow, to be fully who God intends them to be. And so it can't be about assembly lines. It's got to be about greenhouses. And creating different environments and different approaches and different places to cultivate and encourage your healthy growth. So that's what we're going to try to do, is we're going to try to create a really good greenhouse here at Riverfront so that all of us can grow well. Yes? All right. Paradigm shift number 5. We need to shift from self-help quick fixes to spirit-infused lifelong journey. We need to change our mindset, our paradigm, from looking for self-help quick fixes to a spirit-infused lifelong journey. Lauren Winner, who has written some great stuff, she grew up in a Jewish family, converted to Episcopalianism, dawdled a little bit in evangelicalism. She's a great writer. I've met her a couple of times. She's come and spoken at churches that I've led before. She writes this: sometimes, as in a great novel, you cannot see until you get to the end that God was leaving clues for you all along. I love that quote because it points to a really important reality. Spiritual growth, our growth as human beings, it sometimes doesn't make sense in the moment. We only see it as we look back at the longer journey. And in our day, in our society, we are so amped up to be able to self-help. But let's be honest, if self could help, self would have helped a long time ago. The reality is that often self can't help, that I actually need someone beyond me. I need you, I need community, I need the divine spirit. That I'm not strong enough or good enough or talented enough myself. Self-help, quick fixes, aren't how we get to spiritual maturity, spiritual formation. But it's a lifelong journey of reflection, right, of seeing where God has been present all along, leaving little cute clues of the divine. And part of what we want to do is help learn together how we can see that process at work. We've used this language before. Many of us here at Riverfront have been through a process of spiritual kind of deconstructing what we believe as we've gotten older and realized that sometimes Sunday school theology, bumper sticker theology, the kind of theology that you can put on a t-shirt, doesn't really work in real life. And so we've had to deconstruct our faith in order to reconstruct our faith. And one of the things in our vision nights that we identified is that Riverfront is actually a place where we can safely reconstruct our faith. Another way to think about it, this is how Richard Warp puts it, and I like this language better actually. He talks about the idea of order, disorder, and reorder, right? That we have kind of an ordered view of the world when we're younger, and then something happens, and crisis or trauma or just experiences, and it gets disordered. And then the task is to reorder it, is to bring meaning making into the process. And that's what we want to do in our spiritual formation, is to help create meaning, to reorder ourselves so that we can become more like Jesus. I think that Jesus gives us a great picture of what healthy spiritual formation looks like. Matthew 13, the parable of the sower. Now that same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat by the lake. Such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat in it, while all the people stood on the shore. Then he told them many things in parables, saying, A farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched, and they withered because they had no roots. Now other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants. But still other seed, it fell on good soil, where it produced a crop, 100, 60, or 30 times what was sown. Friends, there are different kinds of soils. Some are fertile and some are not. Some are hard soil and rocky, and others fertile. What kind of soil are you? What kind of soil are we cultivating in each other's lives? Jesus, he goes on a few verses later to explain the parable. He says this, he says, listen then to what the parable of the sower means. When anyone hears the message about the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in their heart. This is the seed sown along the path. It wasn't able to take root, right? It was shallow. Now the seed falling on rocky ground refers to someone who hears the word and at once receives it with joy. But since they have no root, they last only a short time. For when trouble or persecution or deconstruction comes because of the word, disorder, they quickly fall away. Now the seed falling among the thorns refers to someone who hears the word, but the worries and the stress of this life and the deceitfulness of wealth, of security, choke the word, making it unfruitful. But the seed falling on good soil refers to someone who hears the word and understands it. And this is the one who produces a crop, yielding 100, 60, or 30 times what was sown. My deepest prayer for each and every one of you is that your soil would be good. Your soil would be fertile. That we would be able to eliminate the thorns and the distractions. That we wouldn't try to plant on hard paths, but that our hearts would be fertile soil. And I believe that for us to be able to do all the other things that we're talking about, become an anti-racist church and establish a space, an incarnational space, to be a place of healing for the LGBT community, to be a place for the next generation, to be a place of hope for our world and our city, and all the things that we dream that our church can be. For all of those things to even begin to take place, this has to happen. That you and I need to be formed spiritually, soulfully, like that of Christ Jesus. And so we need to be good soil. We need to shift our paradigms from thinking that that's only for the superhero Christian, the extraordinary, and recognize that it's the ordinary life of the ordinary disciple to become more like Jesus. We need to change our paradigm from trying to training. We need to get beyond programs to discover our unique pathway. We need to reject assembly line Christianity and instead cultivate greenhouses. Greenhouses for the soul. We need to resist the temptation of quick fix, self-help theology and embrace a lifelong journey of learning, of growing, of cultivating, of becoming, of reconstructing, of reordering, of meaning making. And in all of that, we will come to see Jesus as he really is. And in seeing Jesus, as the scripture says, we will become like him. Rachel Held Evans, a really powerful writer who tragically died not so long ago, writes this: "But if the world is watching, we might as well tell the truth. And the truth is, the church doesn't offer a cure. It doesn't offer a quick fix. The church offers death and resurrection. The church offers the messy, inconvenient, gut-wrenching, never-ending work of healing and reconciliation." Amen? Friends, that's the work of spiritual formation. That's what we're all about here at Riverfront. The work that is messy and inconvenient and gut-wrenching, the never-ending work of healing and reconciliation. I pray and I invite you to come on the journey with us, that you'll be part of our community, as messy and as hard and challenging as it'll be, that together as one people, all unique, we will seek together, we will keep our eyes on Jesus, who's the author and perfecter of our faith, running the race, the pathway set before us, that we might become more like him as our souls get formed, as spiritual formation takes place in our lives. I hope you're excited about this journey, because it's who God has created us to be, and it's what God has created us to do. And all else, all other fruitfulness, the fruits of the Spirit, the fruits of justice, the fruits of righteousness will flow from who we are being formed into the likeness of Jesus. Amen.